Hey, welcome to week 5 for Research and Education. It's Dr. Henkel here, and let's go ahead and open up in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for today and the start of a brand new week. And I just pray that you would guide my students as they are learning this new material for quantitative studies. And I pray that you would put it in their hearts as a way that they could use it to glorify you, Lord. And I pray that you would be with them as they study, and you would just give them wisdom and understanding to be able to not only just to learn the material, but also to think of how they can apply it to their lives. And I pray for their families that you would just continue to protect them and bless them. And I praise you for helping my sister get out of the ICU, and what a blessing that is to be able to have that miracle happen. And I just thank you so much. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So my sister's at home now. She was in the hospital for 11 days. And so now she's at home. She has an oxygen machine that she still has to use because she'll get desaturated down to the 80s like when she stands up. So she'll just sit back, sit down, take in the oxygen, and then she's getting up in her saturation levels quicker. So thank y'all so much for continuing to pray for my sister Bree. So she says thank you. And so here we are. We're on, week 5 of Research and Education. I think I said 4 earlier, so pardon me. So week 5, and here's the top section that you're very familiar with by now, and it's about quantitative data collection. So we'll have a video here for you to watch, which you're doing now. Good job. And then you're going to have to read. It's best if you pre-read before you start this video. So make sure you've already read that. And here's the objectives for this week. And then here's where you'll find the PowerPoint. So what I like to do, I like to print it off and put 3 slides per page. And then I have a section for the notes. So as I read and I'm going over the material, I always like to do that whenever I'm doing something like this because it gives you a place to write your notes. And as well as during the lecture, you can write down your thoughts or questions. So I'll go and, jot something down. Maybe I want to add a PowerPoint for this or that. So go ahead and we're going to jump right into the PowerPoint here. Okay, so here's our objectives. And there are 5 steps whenever we're collecting data for quantitative measurements. And that's what we're going to focus on this week is just your quantitative studies and how do you go about collecting data for doing the research part of your study. And there's 5 steps. So they've broken it down. Creswell has pretty good. So the first step is determining your participants in the study. Step 2, you obtain permissions that are required. Step 3, you consider what types of information to collect from your sources. Step 4, you locate and select the instruments that will give you the useful information for your study. And then the last step, you administer the data and the collection process to collect the data. So those are the 5 steps that we will go into more depth right now. So we'll start with what participants will you study? So what you're going to do is you identify your unit of analysis. Okay, so that's who are you going to study, get information from? It could be an individual, it could be from a family or a school district. That's where you'll be gathering your data. Now, there's different units of analysis that you can collect. You can do one for your dependent variable, and then you might have a different unit of data to get for your independent variable. So you can have more than one. It just depends on how you've built your study and what you'll need. So first you need to specify the population and the sample. So the population is a group of individuals or unit that have the same characteristics. Okay, And then a sample would be a subgroup of that larger population, and they gather information to make generalizations about a target population. So they might grab a little bit of people from the general population, and they consider that their sample. And then they can make generalizations from that sample and apply it to the general population. Okay, samples are only estimates. The difference between a sample and the estimate is the true population is the sampling error. So whenever you have your sample and then you have the true population, the difference between those two is called your sampling error. So what's the difference between those? Okay, so basically you're just going to take a sample from the population. It'll be hard to get everybody's information and do a study. That's just too much. So here's a good visual on that. So you have your target population in the gray circle, and then you want to take a sample out of it. And so over here, here's your sample. So the population, is an example, would be all teachers in high school in one city. The sample from that group would be, how about you just take all high school biology teachers? That would be your sample. Or if you had college students in a community college, so all of them, all community colleges, all college students, that's a huge population. Okay, say to take a sample from that, you would students in one community college, okay? So that's a much smaller sample size. And then the last one, adult educators in all schools of education. Well, let's try to bring this down a little, narrow it down. Adult educators in 5 schools of education in the Midwest. So they've brought it down to a specific number of schools and a specific location. And so these represent what a sample would look like, okay? Okay. It didn't go, sorry. Okay, so now if you're specifying your population and your sample, what about the probability sampling approaches? Okay, so this is how you're going to get your sample. There's different methods that you can use. The first method is called probability sampling. This is the selection of individuals from a population so that they represent the population. Or you might use the non-probability technique, okay? Non-probability is sampling the selection of participants because they are available, convenient, or represent some type of characteristic the investigator wants to study. So as you can guess, probability sampling is the more rigorous form of sampling in quantitative research because the investigator can claim that the sample represents that population, and then therefore they can make generalizations to that population, okay? Now, you won't be able to make generalizations most likely with this type of sampling, the non-probability type of sampling. Or you may need to do this because you just want participants that want to volunteer in your study. So that might be the reason why you do that type of sampling process. And also, maybe you're not wanting to make generalizations across a whole population, so you wouldn't need to do a probability sampling. So those are just some of the questions that you think about while you're designing your study and thinking about how you're going to gather your data. Okay, so this is different types of quantitative sampling strategies. So we just mentioned the probability sampling right here, and then over here is your non-probability sampling. So here are 3 different examples of probability sampling methods, and then here are 2 non-probability sampling methods. And we're going to go and discuss each of those. So the first one, when we're talking about probability sampling approaches, the first example that you could do would be called a simple random sampling technique, okay? So this, you select a sample from the population, so all in the population have an equal chance of being selected. Okay, so that means this is the most popular and the most rigorous form of probability sampling. What you would do is you would assign a number to the individuals in your sample and in your unit to an individual or a unit, and then you would use some type of program to randomly select your participants. So you would have your participants, you'd give them all a number, and then you would get a program to generate a random number sampling to pull out those participants. So one that I used for my research, for my dissertation, was SPSS, and that's just one of the programs that you can use. There's also different ones, like just an online number generator. You could do it like that to select your sample. So another way to do it, it's a variation of the simple random. It's called systematic. Sorry. So your systematic sampling technique, like they would choose every like nth individual, like your fifth individual, or site location in the population until the desired sample size is achieved. Okay, so that's just a different variation of the simple random technique. Okay, so going to your next page, we are still looking at probability sampling techniques to getting your group together on who you're going to gather your information from to do your research study. Okay, so the first one here is on this page. It's talking about stratified sampling. So stratifying the population on a characteristic, for example, gender, then sampling from each stratum. So basically, stratify just means to divide. So if you have a big group and you're going to divide them into gender, say male and female, okay? And then you can use simple random sampling to get a sample out of each group. So you'll do a simple random technique to pull out females, and then the same thing to pull out your males, but after first dividing them into male and female groups instead of just trying to pull it from the whole group, because you wouldn't get an even sampling that way if you're trying to see how gender plays a role in your study. Okay. The next one is called multi-stage cluster sampling. It says a sample chosen in one or two stages because the population is not easily identified or is large. So let me see. It's done in multiple stages just because it's so big. So they would pull out a group, and then they would pull out another group from that group. So to get a little bit smaller. So I believe an example in the book, it talked about if you had public schools in the United States, but then you wanted just high schools, so you'd pull all the high schools out, and then maybe you just wanted all your biology teacher, something like that. So then you would pull out of that sampling, okay? Or maybe for test scores, Okay, so this is an example of the stratified sampling. Remember, stratifying means divide. So here you have your whole general population, 9,000 students, and 6,000 are boys and 3,000 are girls. So they've grouped them out. But now they want a sample size that's proportionate to the population. So they wouldn't want 50% of them to be pulled out to be boys and females, because that doesn't represent how many boys to girls ratio there is. So you see here that the girls make up about a third, and then the boys make up 2/3 of the population. And so then here we have a sample size that's better matched to what the actual size of each boys versus girls is, ratios. And then they have a sample here of 300. So just remember that stratification, they're dividing. So they're dividing them into different subgroups, okay, so that they can get their sample that way. Now, there's a typo on this. This needed to be non-probability sampling approaches. So right here, it should say non. So on your notes, write non and then probability. So we're going to talk about the non-probability sampling approaches. The first one's called convenience sampling. So they get their participants because they are willing and available to be studied. So it's convenient. Or another way that they can get it is by snowball sampling. So they ask the participants to identify other participants to become members of the sample. So it's just kind of like a word of mouth. Well, if you know anybody that wants to do this, send them my way. That's called a snowball sampling technique. Okay. Now, with the first one, the convenience sampling, they say when you do something like that, when you're selecting the participants because they're willing and available, you can't really say with confidence that your sample represents the population. So that's the downfall of doing these type of techniques, is that it just kind of limits on what you can say about the results of your study. And you don't want that. You want to be able to make generalizations, and because that helps others that are learning from your material and how to apply it to their situation. Okay, so now sample size. Whenever you're looking at the population, you also need to look at for sample size. So it's important to determine size. Okay, the larger the size, the less the potential error there is for your research, and then you actually find the statistical analysis of the error percentage whenever you do your data. So first type of error, it says here, it's called sampling error. This is when you find the differences between the sample estimate and the true population score. So that can tell you just about how much sampling error is within your study. And then it says sample size formula. There are formulas that you use to calculate based on the confidence in the statistical test and the sampling errors. So this just provides a means for calculating your sample size and getting what that size is. And then there's a formula that you use to follow that. Okay, so now we're going to go into step 2 of collecting quantitative data. So the second step, which is obtain different types of permissions. So what permissions will you need? So you do have to get permissions to be able to gather data, because they require this because they're able to better regulate what type of studies are done and the fidelity of the study and the validity and the reliability. And so it's a good check and balances type measure. So to obtain different types of permissions, they may look for institutions or organizations like your school districts, specific sites like a secondary school. You're going to have to get permission from individuals that participate in the study, parents of participants who are not considered adults, and you might also need to get campus approval and institutional review board, or your IRB approval. And we'll go into more in depth onto each of those. And if you'll look on page 145 in your text, I'm going to read this to you, and it's about the different types of permission. So it says, the best way to seek permission from the necessary individuals or groups is to ask for it formally in a letter or email. So this is when you're needing to get it from the IRB, okay? So it says, include the purpose of the study, the amount of time you will be at the site collecting data, the time required of participants, and how you will use the data or results. In addition, state the specific activities you will conduct, the benefits of the organization or individual because of the study, and the provisions you have made to protect the anonymity of study participants. So they need to remain anonymous. How are you going to do that? So there's a lot that you have to put into that letter to obtain approval. You can do it through an email, and you would have to send it to the institutions or wherever that you are doing and gathering your data from. Okay, so to get review board approval, there's usually a committee or faculty, and they have at least one person not affiliated with the institution on that review board, and they review it to ensure research protects the rights of the participants. So they're just focused on making sure that the participants, that their rights are not violated. Okay. Process of obtaining approval from review boards. So you start by finding out what about the review process used at your campus, determine what information the review board needs about your project, develop an informed consent form for participants to sign before they participate in the study, submit a description of your proposed study to the IRB. And then this is an example of what the consent form, an outline of it. So it'll have a title. And then if you look on page 147 in your textbook, it gives you an example to follow. So that's very convenient. And then I'll have the voluntary participation statement. And then the right to withdraw, the purpose, procedures being done, right to ask questions, obtain results, get a nominee, and no known risk or state risk if known, benefits, signature line for the participant, and information about the investigator. So like your name and information, okay? Okay, so that finishes up step 2 on getting consent. So now we're going to move on to step 3, and it's going to be about the flow of activities of collecting the data. So now here's a nice little flow chart, and it gives you examples on how to collect the data. And then here it says, what are your options for collecting information? First thing you need to do is define your variables that you're going to have. Specify how you will define and measure the variables, identify how you'll measure them, and cite other authors who have defined them. So you can do that within your study. Now, choose types of data and measures. So, instruments. An instrument is a tool for measuring, observing, or documenting quantitative data. Types of data. Measures of individual performance, measures of individual attitude, observations of individual behavior, and factual information. So those could all be defining your, so to help you choose your data and your instruments that you're going to use, okay? Now we're going to look at performance measures. This assesses an individual's ability to perform on an achievement test, intelligence test, aptitude test, interest inventory, personality assessment inventory. So all of these are examples of performance measures that you can use to gather data for your study. Now, here's an example of an instrument that measures performance. So it actually measures aptitude, and the examiner scores each answer as correct or incorrect. Okay, so they're given this question to a participant. They have to write down their answer. The investigator is going to write that as either correct or incorrect. You give it a score, and that's called its raw score. And then you can use tables to be able to organize your scores to be able to aggregate the data for your research, okay? So this is just an example of an instrument that you could use to get different types of data. And so in order to be able to process the data and the answers, you have to score it. So you have to say, okay, this one's incorrect, gets 0.1, correct gets 0.2, you know, something along those lines. Now, alternatively, attitudinal measures measure the feelings toward educational topics. Okay, they can write to encourage an honest response. And limitation is that there's no evidence of specific behaviors. So they measure the attitudes. So this is a popular form in quantitative data whenever you're using like surveys, correlational studies, and experiments. You'll see these type of measurements when they measure an attitude. So, but the downfall, like here, it says no evidence on specific behaviors. So let's say, you know, would you carry a gun to school, teachers? Yes or no. 1 for yes, 2 for no. But then you're not actually learning how many teachers carry guns onto campus. Let's say the campus is allowed to, of course. So that's what it's meaning by the limitation. You don't know exactly like the answer to the question, really. You're just kind of getting an attitude or a general feeling towards something. Okay, now we have behavioral observations. So it's just another method of gathering data. Maybe you're just watching behavior. This is similar to what teachers do in the regular classroom. I did it a lot. Whenever you're looking at student behavior and maybe you're going to have to go to an ARD meeting or to a behavior specialist, and you're recording that child's behavior for behavioral intervention. Okay, so you would sit and you would mark how many times they did, a certain behavior or however it is that y'all had it set up to do. So what you do is you select an instrument to record that behavior. You would observe that individual for that behavior, and then checkpoints on a scale that reflect the behavior. So you just have many, like 1 to 5 checkpoints was this scale, not likely. Maybe 5 to 10 was likely, and 10 to 15 was very likely. So you would just kind of have a scale on how many checkpoints represents that behavior and the severity of it. Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at factual information. So what factual information is out there for you to analyze? It could be personal documents. It could be numeric data, individual data available in public records. For example, like grades, school attendance, student demographic data, census information. There are privacy regulations that may apply. Like if you're trying to get students' health information, you're not going to be able to get that because there's privacy regulations in place to protect the students' health records, privacy. Okay. And now we have digital methods of data collection. So you can use like websites or internet to administer surveys. I've done that before. There's plenty out there like SurveyMonkey, so that you can just create them and then email them out. Gather interviews. Maybe you're looking on social media, Facebook or Twitter, or you're using existing databases that are out there already. Okay. So how do you decide what types to choose? Well, you need to select your data sources and ask the following questions. Okay. What am I trying to learn? What is realistic to collect? What's available? What are the advantages and disadvantages? So those are the 3 key questions that you can ask yourself when you're deciding on what type of instrument that you want to choose to use to collect your data. Okay. Now here's 3 options. Okay, so when you're trying to locate or develop an instrument, you have 3 options. First, you can develop it yourself. That's the hardest option. So you're going to want to go with option 2 or option 3. Option 2 says you modify an instrument. So you locate an instrument that's already created, you obtain permission to change it, and then you make the changes in it to fit your requirements. So that's modifying it. Or you locate one to use in its entirety. So it has everything that you need, and that's the one that you're going to use. So option 2 and option 3 are a lot easier. Whenever you try to make your own, they give you a process of how to go about doing that. There's a planning process. Then you actually construct it. Then you're going to give it a quantitative evaluation. And then you're going to have to establish validity. And so this is a nice little visual of how that process works. As you, if you're searching for an instrument, there's different places to look. First, you can look in published journal articles because they will have other researchers that have done studies, and they will state what type of instrument that they use, and you're like, okay, I'm going to write that one down. I like that. And so that's a good place to find ideas. So as you're like doing your literature review, keep an eye out for that because you're going to be able to use that information when you're at this stage of your research study, okay? Also, you can run an ERIC search, like on that database where we talked about, and search for a certain instrument that way. You can check test and print, and then there's also mental measurements yearbook that you can also go and look, or the hardest way would be to develop your own instrument, okay? But here are really great resources on where you would need to go to look for ones that are already created, okay? So now there's criteria in how to choose a good instrument. You're like, okay, I want to pick one. Which one should I choose? So you're going to have to ask yourself these questions. Have the authors developed the instrument recently? Is the instrument widely cited by other authors? Because that it gives it validity, okay, and reliability. So are there reviews available? Are there reviews available for the instrument? Is there information about the reliability and validity of scores from past uses of the instrument? Does the procedure for recording data fit the research questions hypothesis in your study? Does the instrument contain accepted scales of measurement? So then, are the scores on past use of instrument reliable and valid? So when you're asking yourself, is this reliable? Those are scores for measuring variables that are stable and consistent. Example, a bathroom scale. So every time you step on that scale, it's consistent with giving you the right measurement for your weight, okay? So that's what you're wanting when you are choosing which instrument to use. It needs to be reliable results. Here's the types of reliability. Test, retest. Scores are stable over time. Alternate forms, equivalents of two instruments. Ultimate forms and test, retest. Inter-rater reliability, and then internal consistency. Now, also you ask yourself, okay, is this instrument valid? That means there's evidence to demonstrate that the test interpretation of the scores matches its proposed use. So, types of validity. Evidence based on test content, response processes, internal structure, relations to other variables, and on the consequences of testing. So here's a good little chart, and these are questions that you can ask yourself. Is it reliable? Is it valid? So did the author check for reliability? Did they check for validity? Okay. If so, what form of reliability was reported? And validity. Was an appropriate type used? Was more than one type reported? Okay, and then so on. So these are great questions to ask yourself whenever you're trying to choose what instrument to use. Okay, so do the instrument's data recording procedures fit the research questions and hypothesis? So recording procedures fit the data you need to answer the question. Who records the data? Is it self-reported or does the researcher record it? Participants supplied takes less time. However, when the researcher records the data, he or she becomes familiar with how the participants respond and then hence can control for a higher level of quality of the data. Okay? So it's better if the researcher records the data rather than the participant because the researcher will be able to get more streamlined quality data. Okay, on table 5.4 in your book, it's on page 164. It has a good visual of this right here. And this is just are adequate scales of measurement used. So there's different scales of measurement. And you want to make sure that the types of measurement scales that are used are adequate. Now, for categorical scales, there's two types for categorical. There's nominal and ordinal. And then you have your continuous scale, and that would be your interval, quasi-interval, and then your ratio scales, okay? So combined would mean you'd use more than one scale. So look at that chart in your book and read more on that. and that will just give you information on are the scales that they're using adequate, and it'll tell you what type of scales those are, categorical or not, okay? Or your continuous scales. So now you need to use the use of standard procedures. So whenever you're doing your study, the procedures need to be standardized. So consistent, okay? So you develop a standard written procedure for administering an instrument. You're going to train researchers to collect observational data. So if you're having somebody go in and gather data that they're observing behaviors, you're going to want to train them to do it consistently on how that you would like it to be done. And then you need to also obtain permission to collect and use public documents if that's something that you're doing. There's also ethical issues that you need to be aware of. And this is the fifth step of collecting your data. So your fifth step is administering the data collection. So it's the process to collect your data. So you want to make sure that you're not going to violate any ethical issues. You want to respect individuals and the locations of where you're gathering the data. You need to obtain permissions, okay? You have to protect the anonymity by assigning numbers to instruments. So you want to keep the participants anonymous. You don't want to violate that because that's an ethical issue. You need to respect those who do not want to participate. And then observations can sometimes be disruptive. So just be aware of that. So that's are very important. Okay, so that concludes our PowerPoint display part of the lecture. So I like this type of the chapter about the quantitative. I feel like it's pretty concrete. It tells you exactly what to do, how to do it, what not to do, and it gives you clear instructions to do that. So they did a really good job of giving all that information. So I will conclude this, and then when y'all are ready, go ahead and watch the video that goes over the assignments overview, and then I will explain those to y'all. Thank y'all so much. Take care.